Today, I will tell the story of why everyday life in Britain feels so different to Americans. If you enjoy cultural insights like this, please like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The first shock tends to arrive quietly, not through dramatic difference, but through the absence of familiar signals. For Americans encountering daily life in Britain, the disruption is subtle and persistent. Streets feel older but less ceremonial, conversations feel restrained without being cold, and routines move forward without the visible urgency that often defines American public space. The environment communicates continuity rather than momentum, as if daily life is designed to proceed whether or not it is being actively optimized. Early impressions are shaped by how little is explained. Systems operate with an assumption of shared understanding, and social norms are enforced through understatement rather than instruction. Americans often notice that nothing appears to be trying very hard to impress. Shops close earlier than expected. Public spaces prioritize order over convenience. Small inconveniences are tolerated without comment, as if friction is an accepted part of daily rhythm rather than a problem to be solved. This creates an atmosphere that feels both calm and opaque. Emotional expression exists, but it is rarely amplified. Politeness is present without warmth, friendliness without disclosure. For Americans accustomed to verbal affirmation and visible enthusiasm, this restraint can feel like distance. Yet the distance is not exclusionary. It is structural, built into how interactions are paced and how attention is distributed. Silence is allowed to exist without being filled, and neutrality is not interpreted as disapproval. Beneath these surface impressions lie deeper cultural differences in how effort and seriousness are displayed. In American daily life, engagement is often demonstrated through energy, through speed, volume, and responsiveness. In Britain, seriousness is more frequently signaled through consistency and understatement. Reliability carries more weight than enthusiasm. Excessive eagerness can appear immature, while emotional moderation is treated as a form of competence. Daily routines reflect this value system. Workdays are structured around predictability rather than optimization. Breaks are respected not because they increase productivity, but because they preserve equilibrium. Time is segmented in ways that resist intrusion, and personal boundaries are maintained without being announced. Americans may notice that ambition is present but rarely broadcast. Achievement is acknowledged quietly, often after the fact, rather than anticipated or narrated in advance. Social interactions follow similar patterns. Conversations unfold without urgency, and opinions are introduced cautiously, often softened by humor or deflection. Directness exists, but it is calibrated. Certainty is downplayed, and conviction is masked behind irony. For Americans, this can create a sense of emotional ambiguity, difficulty reading intentions, uncertainty about reception, and a lingering feeling of being slightly out of sync with the surrounding tempo. Over time, this unfamiliar rhythm begins to register as a coherent system rather than a collection of quirks. Daily life is not organized around constant affirmation or visible progress, but around maintaining social balance. The absence of intensity is not a lack of meaning, but a different approach to stability. What initially feels unusual is, in practice, a culture that prizes endurance over acceleration and continuity over reinvention. As days accumulate, Americans begin to notice how this restrained structure shapes emotional expectations. Public life rarely invites personal disclosure, and private life is carefully insulated from collective scrutiny. There is little cultural pressure to explain oneself. Choices are made without commentary, preferences are held without justification, and personal circumstances are treated as self-contained rather than socially relevant. For Americans accustomed to narrating intention and context, this quiet autonomy can feel both liberating and disorienting. Humor plays a central role in maintaining this balance. It appears dry, indirect, and often self-deflecting, used less to entertain than to neutralize tension. Statements are softened through irony, and sincerity is frequently disguised behind understatement. Compliments are rare and often inverted, delivered as mild teasing rather than affirmation. Americans may misread this as detachment, only gradually realizing that restraint functions as a social equalizer. Emotional moderation ensures no one occupies too much space. This approach extends into conflict management. Disagreement is rarely framed as a personal stance. Opinions are expressed as provisional, open to revision, even when deeply held. Language is engineered to reduce friction, favoring suggestion over assertion. For Americans, who often associate clarity with honesty, this indirectness can feel evasive. Yet within this system, it serves to preserve social continuity, keeping interactions intact, even when perspectives diverge. Daily logistics reinforce the same philosophy. Services operate according to fixed schedules rather than customer urgency. Rules are applied uniformly without exception or apology. Efficiency is valued, but not at the expense of order. Americans may notice that problems are acknowledged without reassurance, addressed without visible empathy, and resolved without performance. The absence of emotional engagement is not indifference, but a separation between function and feeling that keeps systems stable. Over time, this environment reshapes behavioral instincts. Americans often find themselves lowering their volume, editing their language, and becoming more selective about expression. The constant American habit of signaling intent, enthusiasm, or urgency gradually softens. In its place emerges a quieter form of presence, less reactive, more contained. Social success depends less on charisma and more on calibration, on knowing when not to speak. This recalibration alters how belonging is experienced. Acceptance is not immediate or overt. It develops through consistency, reliability, and respect for boundaries. Relationships deepen slowly, often without clear milestones. Americans may initially interpret this as emotional distance, only later recognizing the durability beneath the surface. What is withheld early is often preserved long-term, creating bonds that feel understated but resilient. As familiarity grows, the unusual begins to feel intentional. Daily life is designed not to amplify emotion, but to regulate it. The absence of spectacle becomes a form of protection, insulating individuals from volatility. For Americans, this can feel like a reduction in intensity, but also a reduction in pressure. Life unfolds without constant evaluation, and meaning is allowed to remain implicit rather than declared. This regulated emotional climate gradually produces a different internal orientation. Without the constant reinforcement of validation or urgency, attention shifts inward. Americans often find that motivation becomes less performative and more situational. Action is driven less by external response and more by quiet obligation. Daily life stops asking to be justified. Purpose is not announced, it is assumed modestly as part of one's role within a larger, enduring structure. The pace of life reinforces this mindset. Time feels layered rather than segmented, shaped by routines that repeat with little variation. Progress is incremental and rarely dramatized. In contrast to the American emphasis on reinvention, British daily life privileges continuity. Change occurs, but it is absorbed slowly, folded into existing frameworks rather than presented as rupture. Stability is not viewed as stagnation, but as competence sustained over time. This difference reshapes emotional resilience because expectations are lower and expression is tempered, disappointments carry less spectacle, success is quieter, failure less exposed. Americans may sense an emotional flattening, yet also discover a buffer against volatility. Without the cultural demand to constantly project confidence or momentum, personal setbacks lose their narrative weight. They become private adjustments rather than public events. Social belonging reflects the same logic. Community is not forged through enthusiasm or shared ambition, but through predictable presence. Familiar faces reappear without ceremony. Recognition comes through acknowledgement rather than praise. Trust accumulates invisibly, built through repeated unremarkable interactions. For Americans, this can initially feel emotionally distant, but over time reveals a form of security that does not rely on affirmation. What once felt unusual begins to register as a coherent philosophy of daily life. Emotional restraint functions not as suppression, but as calibration. By limiting extremes, the culture maintains equilibrium. Life is not experienced as a series of peaks and valleys, but as a steady continuum. Meaning is embedded in maintenance rather than achievement, in showing up rather than standing out. In this environment, Americans often recognize the contrast not as deficiency, but as alternative logic. British daily life does not compete for attention or demand interpretation. It exists, quietly confident in its persistence. The unusual becomes familiar, not because it changes, but because its consistency reveals intention. Beneath the understatement lies a cultural belief that life does not need to be intensified to be substantial, and that endurance, rather than expression, is often the most reliable measure of depth.